Welcome to the next in a Legendarium series about medieval monsters and magic. Today we'll be talking about the creatures that populated the world's edge in the medieval imagination. We'll be talking about how medieval Europeans saw the world, the creatures they believed populated the oceans, monsters that they believed lived closer to home, and how they could see everyday animals and unfortunately sometimes their neighbors as monsters. In the year 1350, it took as long to sail from the eastern end of the Mediterranean to the west as it had 1,000 years ago, perhaps longer as there wasn't a Roman fleet to keep the sea free of pirates. People sailed in lumbering wooden cogs, using only the stars for navigation. As a result, trade routes tended to stick very close to the coasts, leaving much of the world's map to the imagination. In addition, Europeans knew little more about the Earth's surface than Julius Caesar had. And there seems to be a near universal human tendency to populate the blank spaces on the map with fantastic creatures, which is what we are going to talk about. First, we're going to talk about the sea lanes of the Middle Ages, populated by terrifying creatures called mermaids, and not the pleasant, musically inclined fish folk of modern fairy tales, but half-human horrors that appeared as beautiful women from the waist up and sea creatures from the waist down. They were said to sing beautiful songs that lulled sailors into a deep sleep, and while they napped, the mermaids rent them to bloody shreds with razor-sharp teeth. These medieval mermaids likely derived from the sirens of Greek mythology, which played a similar role in the story of Odysseus. However, the story was adapted for a Christian audience, warning that those who weren't watchful for the devil would be eaten alive. And in another parallel to Greek mythology, the Atlantic Ocean was believed to be dotted with magical islands. One of them, High Brazil, was said to be shrouded in fog all the days of the year except a single day that came once every 7 years, and people were still looking for it on voyages westward and southward into the 1800s. Another island called Thule was said to be filled with apple orchards and rivers of gold, but was patrolled by terrifying fish with the heads of boars. However, the most pleasant of all of these islands was likely that of Quachain, which tale-tellers of the time described as being filled with rivers of wine, where people lived in houses made out of oatcakes, where the streets were paved with pastry, and roasted geese wandered those streets, inviting people to eat them. And finally, buttered larks would fall from the skies like manna. Now, one can only imagine that the people there were quite fat, and that was the point. The Christian writers of medieval times used this place as a warning against the price to be paid for easy living and gluttony, as those who found their way there would soon gorge themselves to bloatation, die from their overindulgence, and their chances of heaven would be greatly reduced. However, the ocean wasn't the only blank place on the map that needed filling. Places such as India, China, and Africa were known to medieval Europeans, but visited by very few, even after the Silk Road from Europe to Asia was restored. Ancient Greek mythology had already provided many fantastic creatures said to live along the world's edge, and perhaps for that reason, medieval Europeans imagined barely seen Asia as a land of wonders and terrors. The ancient Greeks saw the unicorn as more like a rhinoceros, but medieval writers gave it a more pleasing form and a more mythical background. Medieval writers described unicorns as fierce and aggressive creatures who charged anything in sight, goring them with its long horn. And the only way to stop it was to have a virginal girl show her chest to the unicorn, and it would become meek and docile. And this was a metaphor for how purity and chastity could lead one to triumph over the devil. In addition, they believed that South Asia was home to people called the Blemye, who had no heads but eyes in each shoulder. They were also said to have round mouths shaped like horseshoes in the middle of their chests, and some Blemye even had flat faces with no noses or eyes but only 2 small holes which served as eyes and a lipless mouth. Asia was also said to be home to a people called the Cenocephali, a race of dog-headed people who were said to be drinkers of human blood, who waged war in winter and summer, and if they couldn't reach the enemy, they would even drink their own blood. And in an example of how medieval Europeans mixed history with folklore, the Cenocephali were said to have lived in Europe not long after the fall of the Roman Empire. And when the Lombards invaded the north of Italy, as they historically did in the 500s, medievalists believed that they made terrible barking sounds through the night, which convinced their enemies that they had cynocephali in their camps, and the Lombards' enemies fled before the battle ever happened, according to legend. Now, these monsters were exciting and exotic, but since they dwelled at the far edge of the known world, they didn't cause their medieval audience much fear. But another type of monster was believed to lurk in every corner. These were the demons, often shown with furry bodies, cloven hooves, leathery wings, and faces in strange places. Every waking moment, they tried to tempt and thwart Christians from leading a godly life. According to medieval Christian belief, demons were fallen angels, whose dark hairy bodies with wings were a perversion of the angelic form. Though not always visible, they were believed to be ever-present, and medieval stories abounded of these horrid creatures using all manner of traps to lure Christians into sin. Now, even the animals that most Europeans were familiar with were said to have magical powers. Now, medieval Europeans could observe animal behavior as well as we do, and they often did since they worked closely with pigs and sheep and cows for most of their lives, but that didn't stop them from coming up with grand tales about them, some of which had Christian lessons attached. The boar, which prowled medieval forests killing man and beast alike, was said to be possessed by the spirits of Babylonian kings who terrorized and persecuted the Hebrews. Bears were believed to give birth to lifeless lumps of flesh, which they licked to life with magic tongues. Wolves were believed to have the power of flight, helping them to steal chickens and dogs. I wouldn't recommend writing these as answers on a biology test. However, the tale of the badger tells us something about how medieval people saw this lore. Writers described badgers as being hunted for their testicles used in medicine, and when pursued by hunting hounds, they bit off their testicles, leaving them for the hunters while they made a quick getaway. And this served as a metaphor for how Christians must cut off the parts of themselves that the devil could use against them. Though I hope we don't have to go as far as the good badger did. Of course, not all monsters were seen as animal in some form, unfortunately. Some medieval Europeans made any non-Christian into a monster. They were seen as sinners outside Christendom who were always physically deformed in some way. Indeed, crusaders who encountered Muslims were often surprised to see that they didn't have horns and wondered if they hid them underneath their hair. For example, Jews were regularly accused of inhumane practices, such as kidnapping Christian children and crucifying them, then using their blood for black magic, which they used to appear human, as they were in fact monsters who could only disguise themselves in the human form. They were even said to cut out the intestines of Christians for divination. And these outrageous lies were used to justify mass murder of Jews during the Crusades. Similar tales were told about other non-Christians such as Muslims and Tartars, some of whom were portrayed as having red eyes and sharp teeth, and boiling Christian babies in their pots for meals. Such tales helped to justify and fuel Crusader atrocities in Southwest Asia, and this shows us that medieval Europeans didn't just see these tales about monsters as grand tales to tell around the fire or a means of moral instruction, but unfortunately they sometimes used them to justify the murder of their fellow men. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, please let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and up next I'll be covering the legendary kings of England.